Wonderful. Welcome to all of you who are listening live to our conversation today, and those of you who may be phoning in or are listening to it later. This is our Tiara Roundtable, and we bring this virtual roundtable probably about 3 times a year now. And we usually include topics that are important from a standpoint of what we hear our customers and our clients talking about and what we see and observe organizationally and in leadership. So today we're going to be focused on really, what are we doing to design our lives and our workplace, given that we're coming to the end, we hope, the end of a pandemic, or at least we've been involved in it for now, 16 months. So it's time to sort of stop and take stock and see where we all are. In the past year, it's really been a significant amount of change, and it's been accompanied by a lot of uncertainty for everyone. It's unusual to have something that literally is affecting the whole world at the same time. The thing that we know is that there's no playbook for this. There's no right or wrong. There's no way that we all understand how to get through this. So part of our conversation today is really about sharing ideas, sharing insights, sharing things that individuals and organizations are trying, so that we can learn from one another and then experiment and see what will work for ourselves and our own organizations. So before we move forward, I want to introduce our panelists. We have a great group of panelists with us today. So first we have Jenny Elson. And Jenny is the founder of Giant Leapers, and also she's an author. She serves as both an entrepreneur and a consultant, and she focuses specifically on innovation and creativity. So welcome, Jenny. We're happy to have you. And Jenny is welcoming us from the Netherlands. So you'll detect that when she starts to talk. And so she brings a really interesting global perspective to this conversation, which we certainly are welcoming. And then we have Jennifer Karnowski, who's the vice president of NYNEX, the human capital at NiSource. So this is the initiative. Jennifer heads up the initiative for looking at what the future of work will be like in NiSource. And so she's really deep in this conversation around where are we today, where do we want to be, and how in the heck do we get there? And next I want to introduce Melissa Thornley. Melissa is an emotional intelligence expert and also a leadership consultant. And Melissa has, many years of background in terms of leading organizations, and has translated that into the work that she does as a consultant. Also, in many respects, in the creative endeavors, she is someone who comes from a creative background, but her leadership consulting is very much informed by the emotional intelligence expertise that she has developed. And then lastly, Susan Wise is the VP of Culture and Experience for the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago, which is a very large organization that is actually nationwide in the U.S. But the bank in Chicago is a large organization, and like Jennifer, Susan's also very much involved in looking at what is the future of work for the Fed and how will that unfold as things move forward. We also have with us Sydney Alderson, who's a member of our Tiara team, and Sydney is helping to produce the program today. And for those of you who are listening in live, if you have a question, you're welcome to put it in the chat box, and Sydney will send a text to me so we can include it in our conversation when we have time. So here we are. Our 4 panelists bring a really broad set of experiences and a broad set of insights that they can offer to this conversation. And I'm really excited to tap into that, because we've seen on both an organizational level and an individual level that this pandemic has had an enormous impact on everyone. And so we want to be able to explore what are organizations doing. We also want to be able to explore how are individuals managing and working through this. On an individual level, interestingly enough, a few weeks ago, Adam Grant, who's an organizational psychologist, he works at Wharton, wrote a really interesting article in the New York Times. And he basically said, here's where we are. That blah feeling that we all have, we're going to call languishing. And so it really put a name to this sense that people have of not just the uncertainty, but almost that loss of motivation, that inability to focus. I don't know about all of you, but I hear that a lot from people. Like, I just can't stay focused on things. And so it was helpful, I think, to put the name to it. It caused a lot of really great conversation. And I think the question that we have today is, okay, so now we know what languishing is. How do we shift then into flourishing? How do we move beyond this state of malaise that we have into a space where we feel like we're really flourishing? So, Melissa, I'm going to ask you to get us started on this one. And when we talked, you mentioned that for you in the past, flourishing would have looked like go, 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 out and about, like lots of things going on. And then you're really having to reframe that. So, will you share a little bit about what's happening for you as well as what you're seeing for other people?
Yeah. Thanks, Peg. It is a really great question because we've been in our little caves, our little cubby holes for the past 16 months. And so there are things that we've been missing and wanting and craving, and now we can have them. And it's sort of like, for ice cream fans out there, it's like going to 31 flavors and you want all of the ice cream. But we all know if you eat all of the ice cream, you're going to have a tummy ache. So it's just giving yourself space for grace to reframe everything, right? To not assume, okay, great, I really want to go see this theater. I want to go to this theater. I want to hear this music live. I want to see all of my friends this weekend. It may be overwhelming. Our systems are not going to be used to it. So allowing space for grace for ourselves and also for those around us, because one thing that people are noticing is they may want something and then they may go to experience it. And then when they are in that experience, they realize it might be overwhelming. And so then they might react in a certain way and it might have nothing to do with you. So you might be noticing this among your colleagues, whether you're starting to come back to the office, you might notice this around your peers and your friends. So just space for grace is my number one request for all of us as we move through this time. And space will allow us to flourish.
And you're reminding me of a logo, not a logo, but just a shorthand that I saw the other day. Instead of fear of missing out, there's a fear of going out. So people who have been sequestered and in their bubbles and have been very vigilant about that, they see the opportunity to go out, but it feels unsafe. Like they have to get past all the ways they've been thinking about that to really be able to step outside that bubble and do the things that they would be interested in doing. Yeah. So Jenny, when you and I had this conversation, one of the things that I loved is that you said that creativity, inspiration, and aha moments are essential elements of flourishing. So you want to expand on that a little bit and share your thoughts on how we get to that place?
Yes, thank you, Peg. Well, I feel that one of the things that is helping us to surprise ourselves are those things. And maybe in the past, we always needed other people to do that. And I think that's now, the challenge that's in front of it is that we let go of our expectations of others and fill ourselves up with these new types of creativity that we can do to make sure that we are in a new space. And I feel that that's also what is happening in the nicer companies that I ran into. There are a few big corporates that are now really actively busy in divesting in physical space, but are trying to bring tools to the table that you have to take ownership over to invest in, let's say, an emotional and a mental space. And I feel that the corporates that really understand that, they are going to be employers of choice.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's important shifts that we're all beginning to observe in some companies. Yeah. So Jennifer, you also added that organizational perspective, and you talked about the importance that you're seeing of directly engaging employees in the dialogue, like really fostering those conversations. And one of the things that I was really interested in were all the variety of ways that you all have experimented with and looked at how do we continue to engage people. So will you share some of the things that you're seeing that are working for NiceHorse in terms of engaging employees in dialogue?
Sure. Thank you. And that's been the most fulfilling part, is hearing, what's on the minds of employees and such. And so we've taken a couple different avenues. Actually, just yesterday, we conducted our first, maybe not others, Ask Me Anything session. So we invited employees to an open forum about future of work. We had a panel discussion, and employees could ask any question that was on their mind. And it was very well attended. That was a great way to engage. We've engaged them in other traditional ways too. Surveys, mailboxes that they can ask questions in, town halls and other elements. But we also did a large kind of interactive crowdsourcing session where we were able to get feedback on very specific future of work topics from a lot of employees all at once. And that was incredibly helpful in shaping our strategy and journey going forward.
Excellent. And I think a lot of organizations are challenged right now. You don't have the ability to draw everybody into a workspace and say, okay, everyone come get together. And so it really is creating a lot of opportunity for folks to become much more tuned into how do we go about doing that? And how do we try different modes and different means that will engage our staff and our employees? So Melissa, we were talking about this from the organizational construct. As an individual, what are the ways that you would look at creating and drawing from inspiration? How do you go about doing that?
Well, one of the I go both ways in terms of the familiar and finding something new. So it's always great to explore an avenue that you haven't explored. So that notion of being a tourist in your own city, whatever that city happens to be for you, to explore something new. Also, there's the opportunity to look at the everyday, look at the ordinary with new eyes. That song that you hear on the radio that you've heard 50,000 times, pause, pretend like you've heard it for the first time when it first came out, and everything is new and fresh. So to allow your perspective to open up new realities, whether it's something familiar and ordinary, turning that into the extraordinary, or looking to a completely opposite perspective than you've normally looked. And that's where I tend to find inspiration.
Yeah, so it's really, I love this idea of drawing from the familiar and also pushing the boundaries a bit in terms of new experiences, and then finding ways of making past experiences feel fresh again. And that looking through new eyes, I love that perspective as well. So here's what we know is organizations are having staff return to the workplace. And one of the things I read recently, and this was true for the United States, so I don't know about how it stands for the rest of the world, but that roughly 60% of our workforce, if we're in our normal work environment, would actually need to do their jobs in place. So in Jennifer's case, she represents a utility. You can't be a utility lineman and from your home office. You have to be out in the field to do that. But about 40% of jobs can be done virtually. So we have about 40% of our workforce that we're in the process of making all these decisions about, who needs to be in the office or the workplace, who could work from home, who could be in a hybrid. There's, everyone's in that kind of a conversation right now. I think one of the things that I'm curious about is how we're preparing people for that need to accept that, our workplaces are never going to be the same. This is going to be something different. It's not going to be the same. We're not going back to the way it was. That's a memory, but we're not going back to that. So one of the things, Jenny, that you mentioned is in this place of uncertainty when we're, trying to figure out how to move forward, that it really is important for us to recognize that we're going to be challenged to change our habits and we're going to be challenged to shift our mindset. So you want to offer a little bit more about this notion of changing habits and mindsets.
Yeah, one of course, most of us have done our MBAs and we learned how to do this. So it's very difficult, like Melissa said before, to work on different perspectives. But important to me is that when you are in the setting of a business environment, we always talked about leadership. I think now we need to talk about extreme ownership and about swarm intelligence. So the way we will organize ourselves is much more a second nature now in how I want to fit in the total scope. And if companies allow that, then these new habits will organically appear. It's like the famous story of the elephant paths. You can try to make a path where people walk on, but most of the time people find their own path how to walk. But that, of course, allows a different context. And that context has to be a context where you have the mandate for extreme ownership of how you organize yourself. And I think also, like in nature, you need extreme ownership, or let's say, tools for extreme ownership to do that. And it's not about learning how to lead something, because things will be so unexpected that you really can't use, a list of things that you need to do. You have to have that combination of extreme ownership and self-organization, I think. You allow for that.
Yeah, so I'm going to ask a follow-up. How would you define extreme ownership? I think it's an intriguing term to me. What would you say that actually is? What does it look like?
Extreme ownership is much more that you are connected around a purpose instead of goals. Yeah, because when you have goals, you have to lead to the goals. But here, it's much more the consciousness around what is it that we together want to achieve. And then you will see that diversity and inclusion is also very much a natural process going forward. So extreme ownership to me is really telling yourself that you have all the abilities and all the talents to bring whatever you need to do to a good end. But in your own way, because you feel what the rest of the self-organization, the swarm needs.
Yeah, so a piece of it is having that clarity around the vision so that everyone is working towards that greater vision, and that's a shared vision. And then having that insight to yourself to know, how do I work best? What are my strengths? What is my sweet spot? What are the ways that I bring my best forward so I can make a contribution towards that particular vision that we have?
Yeah.
Great.
And I also, sorry to interrupt.
That's right.
And I also think that in that sense, we unburden ourselves a little bit of all the expectations that were around all these classical paths of, how we should do things. So I think that is also a very nice reward that we get from the corona.
Yeah, yeah, and we are often at this point looking for the gifts. What were those gifts about the coronavirus? And sometimes it's a stretch to find them.
Yeah.
So Jennifer, I'm going to turn to you, because one of the things that that NiceWorks did organizationally was declare right out of the gate that we're not going back to a pre-pandemic model. Our workplace will not look that way. So while a lot of companies hesitated and waited to see how things would unfold, you actually made a pretty bold move in terms of making that known right out of the gate. What's been the impact of that? How has that affected the ability that you have to move forward? What was the reaction from employees and staff? Tell us a little bit about how that landed.
Sure. That was one of the very first things we kind of came out and said. And the reason we did it was actually to try to bring some clarity in such a time of uncertainty. Like, there were so many questions swirling around about, will we go back? When will we go back? All of this. We felt like we needed to kind of start to paint the picture that it was going to be different no matter what.
Yeah.
And the reaction from employees was actually more positive than the reaction from some of our leadership. So it has taken us, and I'm seeing some heads nod, so that makes me feel like I'm in good company here. But I think it took our leadership a little bit more time to consider that we are going to be moving into a completely different and new way of working. And I think we've made incredible progress with employee feedback and other things that we mentioned. 94% of our employees that were surveyed that are mobile or remote said that they would likely be in the office less than 3 days a week. So that's very consistent, Peg, with some of the things that you've mentioned, and it's very consistent. But leaders almost saw it as an affront to wanting to be together. We had to work through some of that wasn't really what it was demonstrating. So that was a very helpful step in getting our conversation going a different direction.
Right. Yeah. And Susan, you mentioned when we talked that, in many cases, people are actually chomping at the bit to go back to what was. So, what are the ways that you all are beginning your communication and confronting that and finding ways to bring people forward?
Yeah, I mean, since shortly after the pandemic started, we have been really good about communication and transparency. Even when we didn't have the answers, we still opened up the conversation with our employees and said, "Hey, we don't have the answers. We don't have a crystal ball. We don't know exactly what this looks like. But as we figure it out, we will share with you." And so, in drips and drabs over the last 16 months, we have, had many open forums for Q&A, town halls for the entire organization, and involved individuals across the organization in figuring out what the future looks like, and collecting their feedback along the way. And Jennifer mentioned this, a lot of pulse surveys, asking for feedback, asking for insight. I do think that helps, and Jennifer mentioned this, it helps pave the path to kind of acceptance of a new normal when you're involved in the conversation, when you're brought along. I do think there are people that are going to struggle with adapting. I actually think working hybrid, which is what our organization will primarily be, is going to be hard on everyone because you're now some days of the week going to set foot in the office and be surrounded by kind of all this technology you didn't use in the past in the office, right? Because you were all face to face. And it's going to be challenging for everybody initially, but I think those folks that are more comfortable kind of face to face, I think our whole world is going to be different, so everyone's going to adapt, but we definitely are providing training and guidance and best practices and just a whole lot of grace. The organization I work at is very focused on wellness, very focused on mental health, and giving people the grace to make mistakes and move on.
So one of the things that we're identifying is that we will have this potential for a hybrid. We will have this potential that some people will be in the office and some people won't. And in many organizations, not everyone will be there every day, even if people are returning to the office. So it brings us to this question of culture and how do we create a culture that that people really want to be at, that's really hard to leave because you don't have that captive audience of people sort of in front of you every day. So if we really think in terms of the culture being about and really residing in the workforce, it's residing in the people, it's not residing in the physical space, then that brings us to this question of, what do we do to make sure that people want to be there? And when we talked about this question, each and every one of you brought up inclusion and belonging as an important ingredient here. So this really feels like, a piece of the conversation that we want to have. So Melissa, I'm going to ask you just, from the experience that you have, to talk a little bit about inclusion, why it's important, and the other factors to consider in designing the future workplace culture.
Thanks, Peg. Yeah, it's interesting because, we are talking about this through the eyes of the pandemic, but we also have to remember that we've been going through a lot of change from a social justice standpoint as well. And the pandemic has not been great in dealing with marginalized people with marginalized identities. So if there were issues of inclusivity and diversity and equity before, they were exacerbated by the pandemic. And I actually heard the term yesterday, the she session, because the pandemic has impacted women so much more than it has men, particularly because of the industries that it impacted, being travel, leisure, health, a lot of these industries that tend to have more women in those roles. So in any event, it's a great opportunity to reframe things. Companies now, their cultures the leadership realizes that their culture has to focus on belonging and justice and putting their money where their mouth is, not just sort of putting out a statement, that they really have to embody it from the top of the organization down and from the bottom up. So there are really great opportunities now, even just in the process that Susan and Jennifer were talking about, these town halls, these ask me anything, that type of transparency and openness may not have been present before in many organizations, and they have been positioned to do that. So it actually is, with everything thrown up in the air, now we get to reframe how we want these cultures to be, and we get to make more choices when maybe the norm doesn't have to be the norm anymore.
Right, right. So Jennifer, when we were talking about this, you shared a piece of data that was so fascinating to me, that in a recent employee poll, that the information came back, the engagement survey came back and said that people are actually feeling even more strongly connected to their direct leader than prior to the pandemic. And I found that, surprising. I wouldn't have necessarily guessed that, given what we know the challenges have been in terms of working in that remote way. How do you make sense out of that? What are you seeing, and what do you think is going on there?
It's a great, we were surprised by that, actually. Delighted,
Yes.
but surprised. And that was a sentiment from many employees.
Yeah.
I feel like we're staying connected. I feel like communication is better than ever. I'm seeing my leader more. We have a dispersed workforce across multiple states.
Right.
So, being in the office actually may have prohibited leadership connection for some employees that were not in the same location. And I would say the other thing that we heard a lot was that being on the same platform leveled some things as far as voice and contribution and purpose in certain meetings to solve certain problems. And so we actually received a lot of positive feedback that even though it's been challenging and difficult, employees and leaders have been embracing that intentionally within their teams, which has been very, very insightful. And we're continuing to try to build on that with intentionality to make sure that continues going forward.
So Susan, what are some of the things the bank has done to actually focus more on inclusivity as we're going through and managing through this pandemic?
I think, in diversity, equity, and inclusion has always, for the last 10 years been a focus of the bank. And I think we were maybe ahead of the curve of some or some private organizations. So I think, obviously the social and racial injustice that happened in 2020 put everyone on high alert and in recognition of, that they need to be and act differently and be more conscious of the inequities that are there. We, for the first time as an organization, I don't want to say we put goals in place, but we spent, the better part of the last year really identifying where we want to be in 3 years, 5 years, and actually put those thoughts on paper and presented it to the entire organization. We'll be presenting it to the entire organization. Yeah. So really committing to how we want to be different. So that was a big step for us. We also have a lot of employee resource groups, and we really tapped them over the last year to help kind of carry the message of the bank that this is important to us. We gave them, maybe we amplified their voices during this time. So it's not just leaders communicating a message of inclusivity, it's, leaders at all levels. It was interesting, hearing what Jennifer talked about. I do think it has leveled the playing field for people, having everyone in a remote posture. And I do have concerns about when we do hybrid, will that kind of shift back to not giving that same equality to staff. But, we also have baked inclusion practices into our recognition strategy, our reward strategy, individual goals. So we really are trying, rethinking, how how equity impacts and inclusion impacts performance reviews. So we're kind of really digging into talent practices too, to understand how they may or may not be inclusive.
Yeah, so what I'm really appreciating here is hearing how this desire for inclusivity and belonging has moved from being sort of an out there kind of desire to looking very specifically at the organization to say, systemically, what do we need to address so that we are managing our talent in a way that reflects that desire on our part? So we move from the desire to the actionable things that we can begin to see and embed in the organization that really reflect that interest. Great. So Jenny, you and Susan haven't mentioned it this time, but both mentioned the importance of designing inclusivity into the onboarding process and how we foster that. And you had some really interesting ideas about, Jenny, about things to include when we're onboarding that will really, create that message that inclusivity is really important here.
Yes, well, I've done several tests with banks in the Netherlands and in Belgium, where we have said, okay, of course, there is the selection process of creating, let's say, a space where people of diverse backgrounds want to be. That's the first thing, of course, but and that's why I hesitate to talk about culture. I like to speak about second nature, because that really is a bottom-up movement. So if you have more diversity and more inclusiveness, then you cannot predict what you get. But what you get is, let's say, the sum of the best habits that we have together. So what we installed is a connection program where we connect the, let's say, the top 100 with the 100 people that come in. And because of that connection for 100 days, everything that becomes static in the culture is being challenged by the new people coming in. And by really listening to that, you get, let's say, a better a better taste of what that second nature also could be. So that's what we are experimenting with, and so far so good. But of course, it's also a test. We're trying new things, and but what I see from it is that it's very difficult to, if you really want inclusion, to say you have to relate to this culture. No, together you create a second nature that is fitting what is necessary to create the purpose or the vision or to follow the vision. So I think that's truly important.
Yeah, and I think it's an interesting perspective, and calling it second nature does really hit home on the idea that culture is a reflection of the people in the organization. And that's another way of really framing that up in a way that I think makes good sense. So one of the things that we've observed is that everyone had their regular job to do, and then the pandemic hit, and we had all kinds of other things that were unknown, and again, no playbook for. So leaders were finding themselves enmeshed in all kinds of details that in the past they wouldn't necessarily have been, involved in. And it kind of leads me to one of my favorite metaphors that's come out of all this is, how do you move from the dance floor to the balcony? So how do you move from being, down in the details and very much doing the things you needed to do there up a level so that you can begin to see what are the interconnections, what are the potential obstacles down the road, how do we create this in a way that does support the mission and the vision? So that requires a shift on people's parts. And that's not always easy to do, especially if we've gotten mired in the details for a while now. So let's talk a little bit about, what might be involved there. So Susan, I'd love to get your insights on, what do you see around how people either are or maybe struggling to make this shift from being on the dance floor to getting up to the balcony?
It's definitely a hard shift. I think the key things, I can only speak from my lens or my vantage point. But I think what's been really key for me is being really clear and intentional with the people that report to me about what I need to be successful, and ensuring that they are managing up to me and giving me the information I need, because then I'm going to be able to be my best self and my best boss or my best coach to them. And so I think, there is, maybe this is something that women typically struggle with, is saying exactly what you need, and being comfortable with that, right? So I think that is a big piece of it, being clear on what you need. I do think the pandemic has broken down a lot of walls, so maybe that's a little bit easier now. But I think that's the biggest piece that I have observed and I have started implementing in my day to day.
Yeah, and Melissa, that takes me back to something you and I talked about kind of earlier, which is this idea of having to be much more comfortable with saying no and asking for help.
Yeah, and one of the things that Susan points out is that, we might notice something. So from an emotional intelligence perspective, we get the emotional data of, okay, this is what I'm feeling about this situation, right? Or this is the emotional data I'm getting from my team, from my direct reports, from my people leader, right? So once we get that, then it's what action are we going to take and how do we assert ourselves? And that and that will then take that data that we're already absorbing and turn it into something actionable for people. And that might be saying no, that might be creating different boundaries, that might be asking for help, but it turns it into something actionable. And yes, to Susan's point, I feel like women tend to be more comfortable expressing the emotion around what is going on and less comfortable asserting themselves and turning it into action. And men tend to do the opposite, where they assert it and they turn it into action, and they may not necessarily give you the background or the information and context. So it's an interesting play there.
Well, and I think, you're the word that you're using that I think is really apropos here is context, because there were a lot of assumptions in the past that everybody understood the context of what we were doing. But this has really turned things upside down, and context is variable. And if we don't take the time to explain the why, explain the context, then people are left to try to sort it out for themselves, and they may come from a very different place there. So this actually brings us back to the individual. So we've talked a fair amount about what organizations are doing. Organizations are made up of individuals. So from the standpoint of how each of us takes responsibility, I'll go back to what Jenny's been talking about, this extreme ownership, how we take, individual responsibility for ourselves. As you're looking, sort of at the landscape of what's going on, what are the leadership traits that you're seeing emerge that are particularly effective and impactful during this time of transition? So, Susan, I'm going to start with you, because one of the things you mentioned was the really important element of listening and really working to understand people. So it's that results and people relationship, personal relationship part of leadership as well. Anything that you would add there in terms of what you're beginning to see at the bank?
Yes, and I'm going to apologize in advance. There's a vacuum cleaner going on in the background. So this is it's real life, right? Working from home.
Absolutely. Yes.
Tell me the question again, Peg. I apologize. I got distracted by the vacuum.
That's all right. So we're talking about leadership traits that will serve us as we move into this next phase, whatever it is. And you specifically mentioned that you're seeing a real shift towards more focus on listening and more focus on really understanding people.
Yeah, I mean, I think this whole COVID experiment has made it really clear that the skills that leaders need now and going forward is really in the emotional intelligence realm, and listening to their intuition, reading people, coming at a situation by stepping into somebody else's shoes, empathy, grace, right? Those are the skill sets that are going to make a successful leader, because by employing those skills, your people relate to you, your people are willing to come to you and talk to you. And so when there's a problem, you're going to be able to solve it before it even happens. You're going to have that connection with your people to deliver the best work. Because, I think the old what model was, I can do everything, right, as a leader, and I'm best at everything. But the reality is that we all bring different strengths to the table. So
Right.
if you can capitalize on everyone's strengths, you're going to deliver a better outcome. And so you need to lead from that mindset.
Exactly. So here we are. We're actually coming to the end of our conversation today. It always goes by much faster than I think it's going to. So what I'd love to do is hear sort of one final thought from each of our panelists on any advice or insights that you have about designing your life and your workplace going forward. So Jenny, I'm going to start with you. What would you?
I agreed with Susan that aligning is very important. And for me, the most creative voices that I've seen have been really good with multimedia. So they know when to use their media. So by example, doing a report in 1 minute through WhatsApp instead of sending long emails, but that type of aligning is also very important now to make use of the media and dare to be different in presenting what you want to say.
Great. So Jennifer, any final insights from you?
I would say just keep an open mind. We're all working through this, and really encouraging our leaders to be intentional with their employees and those connections. And we're all going to get to a new place. We're getting there now. We're on our way. So we just got to keep moving forward.
Yeah. Yeah, that sort of makes me think of the car ride with the little kid that says, "Are we there yet? Are we there yet?" I feel like we're all in a global, "Are we there yet?" Where are we in all this journey? So Melissa, any final thoughts from you?
Yeah, I hate to go the cheesy route. I'm going to go a little cheesy, but gratitude, just reminding ourselves what we have to be grateful for. Not only is it an excellent reminder, it also helps our brain because we can't be grateful and anxious at the same time. And I heard a phrase recently about forgiving everyone in advance. Like, I forgive everybody in advance for anything that ever happens, including ourselves. So when I heard this, it was, of course, a Buddhist that said this, not a Buddhist monk a living Buddhist in the real world, right? But the thought and the aspiration of doing that just allows for so much if you've already forgiven the guy that just cut you off, right? So just forgive in advance.
Sort of like, along with that, for me, it's like remembering that everybody is doing their best. We're all doing our best, and sometimes we're better at it than others. So Susan, final thoughts or insights from you?
That no one has all the answers, and that's okay. And that it's okay to make mistakes as long as you learn from them.
Right.
And I think a little bit, I guess, be yourself. I feel like there's so much grace right now with the vacuum cleaner going on in the background, with the cat going into your computer screen. I think it's opened up the door for people to truly be themselves and let their personalities come through. And I think that's such a positive thing.
Excellent. Excellent. Well, this brings us to the end of our virtual roundtable on designing your life and your work after the pandemic. I really want to thank our panelists, Susan, Jennifer, Jenny, and Melissa, for being here, bringing your expertise, your experience, and your willingness to say, yeah, we're just still figuring it out. We don't have all the answers. So that's the kind of expertise we all actually needed right now. And special thanks to all of you who are listening now or maybe listening later. And also I want to thank Sydney for doing a great job of producing the program today. That was very, very helpful. I'll add a few final thoughts. Feels like in coming out of the pandemic, and we're all crossing fingers and toes that we are actually coming out of it, the changes to our workplace are inevitable. It's just not going to look the same. As Jennifer's organization teed everybody up right from the get-go, not going to be the same. Don't let go of the dream of pre-pandemic. as we shake off this malaise from months and months of uncertainty, we can tap into our inspiration, and we can take an active role in designing our lives in our workplace. And we encourage everyone to think in terms of what can you do? How do you, connect to your inspiration and bring your best self forward in every situation? Our panelists have identified a lot of really great ideas for intentionally connecting in organizations, staff, and leaders. And I think those are all things that if you aren't trying them, give them a try. It feels like they could really be helpful and useful in terms of what we're trying to accomplish. And then everyone mentioned the importance, again, of focusing on inclusivity and belonging and moving it from a desire and an idea into an actionable reality. I think that's where we are right now. And that's what people are hoping and expecting from us. So if you want to find more information about Tiara, please don't hesitate to go to our website, www.tiaraleadership.com. If you enjoyed being part of this roundtable and listening to it, you can sign up on our Facebook page, or go to our website and become a member of our resource circle, and you'll get notifications of our Tiara Talks, all of our programming each month, as well as upcoming future roundtables. And we lastly hope to see you in future programs, and hope that this was something that you learned from and that is valuable. Thank you very much, everybody, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye.